Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric, and I got a really fun and exciting episode for you guys this Friday. Initially I teased it to my Patreon members and then to the general YouTube community under the community tab, because after years of hunting I was finally able to acquire a Panasonic FZ-21 S1TK, better known as a 3DO M2. Now it's a long story of how I got it, we'll get into that in a moment, but if you could do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like, subscribe, that notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, I got a Patreon link down below as well. But this took me forever to find, and there was one on Yahoo Auction Japan, and I placed a bid for $4,200.69. I was the highest bidder. The seller didn't want to take a proxy and canceled my bid, but thankfully I was able to hit the reset button, and somebody that owned one sold it to me because they knew I needed to use it and the community needed it to get some projects done. Now I know what you're thinking, will this play the arcade game? Something like Battle Trist, a game that everyone really seems to love when I talk about and really seems to want to play because it is amazing. Well, the short answer is no, and the long answer is eventually, because people smarter than me are working on getting some of these games like Evil Knight to boot on hardware that was non-target. That is to say, something like an FZ-21 or FZ-35 versus the arcade hardware. But hey, until that point, at least you get a fun Panasonic logo. Now what does this thing play? Well, it plays Pon Pon Land, a raccoon-based memory game for Japanese senior citizens. So software does run on this, and I do have it, I have released it, so you can actually play a 3DO M2 game on the FZ-21. It's just going to look something a little bit like this, but I will tell you, the action is intense. All jokes aside though, trying to find this took forever, and even though it's not currently playing many games, it does come with this fun little vent on one side. It is a very interesting piece of video game history and one that took me forever to find, and I am so glad that I did. I love the design of this case. I love how these buttons push in versus going down, so when I first saw photographs of it, I just assumed they push down, and you'll see that there's even this fun little open button here, and boy oh boy, I wonder what does that do. All jokes aside, I just need to get to the transition for the shot. But right on the front, this is just a video game console, but it is not a prototype. The internet will tell you that the FZ-21 is a prototype 3DO M2. That is, in fact, not true whatsoever. This was a product that was sold by Panasonic in Japan as an interactive multimedia kiosk. This was basically commercial presentation software. Around the back, you have your standard composite video. You got a communication port, an S-video port, power, that's always important, and an expansion port, which in this iteration doesn't do a whole hell of a lot, but it is quite important to the overall operation of the project of trying to get games to run on this. That is because on some of the prototype units, you'll see that there is a PCM-CIA slot on the top, but there's also one on the bottom that I'll talk about in a little bit, and that is kind of the sort of magic gate to getting this thing doing something. But for the meantime, on the FZ-21, hey, it's just an expansion slot, there's no expansions. But taking a look under the hood with the CD-ROM drive here, you'll see it is very basic and looks much like a console, because this is the finished shell for the 3DO M2 had it been sold. Laser, spindle, pretty simple. Interestingly, you'll see the writing is in Japanese, English, French, and German as well. So if this was for sale as a console, I think you can tell, obviously it's going to be in Japan, it's going to be in North America, and it's also going to be in European regions. Now something like this, CG400, it is driver training software, will run on this FZ-21 unit or the FZ-35. Pop something like Toei Polystars in though, and it is going to do absolutely nothing at this current juncture. But I will say, if and when we get this working, it is going to be amazing, because Toei Polystars is my favorite shmup of all time, and even though this is a hardware video, the soundtrack is straight fire, so go ahead and listen for like 25 seconds, and I will be right back. Just such a good soundtrack, but the question is, why would CG400 boot versus Toei Polystars? Well, one, CG400 is encrypted. It is a signed piece of software. Now on the arcade side, some of the drivers and BIOS related items need to be sorted out, but it is also an unsigned game. That is the difference between the FZ-21 and FZ-35. This unit right here requires at least the operating system Opera to be signed before it will execute code. I've talked to so many people that have bought these and wanted to play games and it does absolutely nothing. We're working on it, but in the meantime you do get these really nice vents around the sides because this is a rare piece of hardware, so I figured I would have to show it off to you. But how do I know this is not a prototype console? Well, one, I pretty much know everything about the 3DO M2, not being cocky, just saying it is not. But two, that kanji below Panasonic says Interactive Multimedia Kiosk. It is just a misnomer that this is a prototype console. There are prototype consoles in this shell shape, but it is not this, and clearly this has been used as a commercial product. It's got some gunk on it. But like I said, right below Panasonic, that kanji there says Interactive Media Player. You'll see it's the FZ-21 S1 TK. It's 100 volt, and you can use a step-down converter if you find one, but you don't have to. And it works in both 50 and 60 Hertz, or PAL and NTSC as it were. This is serial number 1307. That means there's at least 1,307 of these made. Does that mean that's how many still exist? Of course not. I'm sure they all got recycled, but you'll see the shell even has this nice molding in it. Now, like I said, this Interactive Media Kiosk, this arcade board, but they do share some similarities, but the kiosk was designed for commercial products. Now, VizHouse, a visual 3D modeling software to design houses, does just work on the FZ-35 because it is unsigned. If we can get the file signed, it may in fact run. But this is what the FZ-21 and the Interactive Kiosk iteration of the 3DO M2 was designed to do. It is commercial, versus the arcade hardware. It was designed to shoot bad guys with a lot of different effects going on. The 3DO M2 was a game console, it was an arcade board, and it was an interactive multimedia kiosk. But now that I have the full hardware set, we can do more fun things with it. Like I said, this expansion port is going to be in some ways relatively important, because if we take a look at some photographs of another one that was just recently opened up by my friend Fixel, you're going to see here that BIOS chip. We have dumped that. Well, he did it, I didn't do it, but now we have the full FZ-21 BIOS and we are able to work with it. But interestingly enough, on the underside of this board, there's also a spot where you can put a secondary PCMCIA slot, and you'll see different jumper positions for different configurations, including a BIOS from the ROM or a BIOS from the card. So we can now put a secondary BIOS on this unit if we want as well, versus on a prototype board, it being there, and that's how you load a ROM in the first place. We have all the ROMs, encrypted and unencrypted, we have the encryption keys, and we can sign software. It is a work in progress, but how are we going to control it when we do it? Well, there's a couple different options. First up is the prototype 3DO M2 controller. I showed this years ago on my channel, but it's never been seen since, and I keep it in this hard case just because it is quite delicate. I'm not that crazy, it doesn't need to be in there except for the cord. You can use one of these. This was what was given to developers when they got development kits, and it is a UFO controller shell, but it has all sorts of different 3DO design silicon inside, and I will show that to you momentarily. But the 3DO M2 kiosk units, the FZ-21 and FZ-35, both use the standard 9-pin cable, a DB9, that the original 3DO console used as well. You can use 3DO controllers on the FZ-21 and the FZ-35. This one's marked M2 Proto Controller, and it's serial number 517, so it's high up there. They should have shipped at least a few of them if you got to that number right there, unless they started at 5 and this is number 17. Like I said, on the inside, it is a complete custom board with an FPGA chip on there. It has a 12 megahertz crystal, and it has a little chip at the bottom that's going to feed it that code. I can play on my unit with this, but honestly, how many of you are going to find this even if you own an FZ-35? So we do have some more options, but I figured you haven't seen this controller in a while, why not put it in the video with the FZ-21, because it's a little bit of fun development history of exactly what 3DO was doing when they were trying to get the M2 to market. And I love the PCB color, it's even hand cut in certain spots, it is rough. But the nice thing is, you can plug it right into the front of the FZ-21 and play, and if you do somehow find one of these units, it is safe to plug in a standard 3DO controller, at least Panasonic branded, that is what I have tested. But there's also a Panasonic branded controller that came with the FZ-21 and 35, but we'll talk about that in just a few moments. But this will play CG400 and the arcade board will play Toei Polystars, but the question is what hardware differences exist, and they are very minimal. Both the kiosk unit as well as the arcade board are going to have the Bulldog ASIC, the CE32 chip, and the dual PowerPC 602 processors. And there are some revisions of the arcade board that barely change anything except some resistors, but they do exist. Now the difference between the kiosk and the arcade board, at least in this iteration, is 8 megabytes of RAM on the kiosk versus 16 on the arcade board. Now that means this would only ever play Toei Polystars because it's the only game that runs on the 8 megabyte revision, versus the arcade board being able to play Battle Trist, Heat of 11, Hell Knight, as well as Total Vice, as well as Toei Polystars because it has that RAM. But we're working on piggybacking some RAM chips if you feel so inclined. But what about something like IMSA Racing or IMSA Racing? Never sure if that's the way you pronounce it. Would this run on the FZ-21? Well, it is under 8 megabytes of RAM storage capacity for executing the code and storing everything. So if we can get this signed, it should run. What about some of the diverse demos like Iron Blood here, the M2 Enhanced version? That is also currently under 8 megabytes as far as I am aware, so that should be able to run as well if we get this project finished up. But there are so many other things we have. I released this M2 demonstration disc for all the diverse items that were given to me by an ex-developer, all the demos in the SDK, and we're going to hope that that's going to be under 8 megabytes as well when it loads up. There's a lot of variables, but the good thing is the Panasonic FZ-35 exists, and that also has 16 megabytes of RAM. So if you're looking to purchase one of these units, please buy an FZ-35. It's going to be much more versatile for you. Or maybe you can even play Heat of 11. It's actually a strangely fun soccer game that I love, and last time I reviewed it I said it was only okay, but I played it a lot more since, and honestly I've gotten more into it. But there's one hanging thread that we need to deal with: light gun support, because 2 of the 5 arcade games run on light guns, not on controllers. How is that going to be done? Is it going to be possible? You'll just have to wait and see, because it's going to be quite the process, but I hope we can get it done. And like I said, if you're so lucky and you find a Panasonic branded controller, you can play the FZ-21 with that as well. This controller is hilarious. It is just a Japanese 3DO FZ-JP2X controller, and honestly the only thing that Panasonic did to rebrand it for the kiosk is they put a sticker over it. And that is not a silk screen, they just cut a sticker and placed it over the 3DO logo. That's how janky the interactive multimedia kiosk business model was. But that is the FZ-21. It took me 10 years to find this thing, and I'm absolutely so happy it's in my collection, and it's going to make a lot of testing possible to try to get the 3DO M2 quote-unquote actually released. I will not rest, and people I know will not rest until this unit here at least plays one actual video game, and when it does that, the 3DO M2 console will have a full game for it that you can play if you so find one at home. Took me a long time to find this, been teasing it for a while, but there you go. Hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.